Unemployment is one of the major economic problems we face in today's world. Many Canadians are left jobless year after year. At first, unemployment was not considered an important government priority in Canada. It is a relatively recent feature of Canadian history. It wasn't until 1870 where Canada first experienced widespread unemployment. Thousands of Canadians had lost their jobs and struggled to provide basic necessities for their families. After these incidents, unemployment was viewed as a major economic issue, which ultimately led to the establishment of the Federal Unemployment Program in the 1940s.
Cyclical unemployment is defined as workers losing their jobs due to business cycle fluctuation in output, the normal up and down movements in the economy as it cycles through boomers and recession over time. The reason to cyclical unemployment in Canada happens in 1980s and 1990s. Recession happened in 1980s lead to unemployment rate of 12% in 1983. During the early 1980s, the nominal GDP in Canada keeps going up from 306 in 1980 to 340 billion USD dollar, but the high inflation rate around 12% and interest rate caused by large government spending shift Canadian firms from focusing on innovation and productivity to seeking investment opportunities, and Canada started to enter a new economic era consists of globalization and a revolution in information technology. Therefore, firms have to dismiss employees to stay competitive, and some jobs have been replaced by mechanics. On the other hand, many workers are not trained for the emerging market, including service sector and computer field. In early 1980s, Canada's employment rate peaked at 12%. The most recent Canada recession began in 1991, and over the next 12 months, GDP fell by 3.2% from 610.33 to 592.39 billion US dollar. Unemployment rate went up from 8.75% in 1990 to 1993, reaching peak in 1993, 11.375%. Some factors contributing to the economic slowdown leading to the 1990 recession included a slowdown in the U.S. economy and high CPI index. The restrictive monetary policy implemented by Bank of Canada was to fight inflation and finally had a negative influence on Canada's fiscal policy, which was trying to halt the recession.
Non-cyclical unemployment. There are two types of unemployment that are not caused by or related to the cyclical trends in growth and production that occur within the business cycle. The first being structural unemployment. It occurs when workers are unable to fill the available jobs because they lack the skills, do not live where the jobs are available, or are unwilling to work at the wage rate offered in the market. It can also be due to the decline in manufacturing, occupational immobility, geographical immobility, disincentive, for example, poverty trap, and long-term regional decline. It includes technological changes, a shift in product demand, and decline in regional industries such as the textile industry in the eastern townships of Quebec and the petroleum industry of the West in the mid-1980s. Structural unemployment can be reduced by provision of training and retraining of employees, as well as an increase in mobility grants to workers and in industries. Frictional unemployment is also a type of non-cyclical unemployment that is also known as Canada's natural rate of unemployment. This type of unemployment occurs because of an absence of demand for a certain type of worker. This typically happens when there are mismatches between the skills employers want and the skills workers have. The Canadian labour market has been undergoing rapid change in the past decade, especially in the 1990s. A large number of Canadian firms have been investing in new capital and more efficient technological methods as a way to reduce labor inputs and costs. This industrial restructuring has definitely played a part in unemployment caused by the mismatching of skills. One of the major causes of frictional unemployment in Canada is a large increase in employment insurance that occurred in 1971, which promoted unemployment by reducing the cost of job search and idleness. It encouraged people to spend more time looking for jobs, which essentially meant that their job search was less intensive. Another cause of unemployment was the increase in the minimum wage during the 1960s and early 1970s, a period when a large percentage of youth were entering the workforce for the first time. A higher wage rate made it difficult for youth to gain employment and on-the-job training. The result of this was young people being forced into dead-end jobs, which essentially led to employment instability and an increase in unemployment levels.
We will now be talking about other notable trends in Canadian unemployment. The first trend we will talk about is youth unemployment spikes during Canadian recessions. It is understandable for Canada to have an average youth unemployment rate that is higher than the average overall unemployment rate in Canada. This is due to the fact that younger workers tend to have significantly less experience than their older counterparts, and therefore it is harder for them to secure work. But one notable trend in Canadian unemployment is a consistently larger increase in youth unemployment when recessions have occurred in Canada. Youth unemployment here in Canada refers to those 15 to 24 years in age who are actively seeking work or have been recently laid off. This notable increase in youth unemployment can be twice as large as the increase in overall Canadian unemployment. This discrepancy is fairly consistent with numerous examples of Canada starting all the way back to 1976. One example is when an economic recession struck Canada in the early 1990s. Before the recession hit Canada, youth unemployment was at a relatively low 11%, with the overall Canadian unemployment rate just below the 8% mark. At the peak of the early 1990 recession, youth unemployment has shot to 18.5%, which is an overall increase of approximately 70%. On the other hand, the overall Canadian unemployment rate only increased to 12%, equating to an increase of only 50%. Youth unemployment had increased by 20% more than the national average, meaning thousands more Canadian youth had either lost their jobs or had a harder time finding work relative to the rest of the country. Another example of this trend, which should be in recent memory, is the subprime mortgage crisis in the USA that occurred in late 2007. That started a recession in Canada. The overall Canadian unemployment rate went to 8.5% from 6%, an increase of 42%, while youth unemployment increased to 16.5% from 11%, an increase in unemployment of 50%. One reason that recessions in the Canadian economy negatively affect youth at a greater capacity is how companies lay off workers in times of slowdown. Companies tend to lay off workers with the lowest amount of seniority, which most times is youth workers. Another reason is companies restrict the amount of people they hire when an economic slowdown occurs. Because they are able to hire less people, companies subsequently only hire individuals with high credentials. Most youth unemployment lack these credentials and thus find it harder to find meaningful employment. The next trend we will talk about is how Canada's unemployment rate is getting closer and closer to the U.S. unemployment rate. Beginning in the early 1970s, Canada's unemployment rate has steadily moved towards the unemployment rate in the United States. The average difference between these two unemployment rates has consistently decreased, most notably over the last 15 years, where the rates have almost been identical. For example, the average gap between the two unemployment rates from 1980 to the year 2000 was approximately 2 to 2.5%, with the Canadian rate being the larger of the two. Starting from the year 2000 to the present date, this gap had dropped to below 1%, with there even being a point in time when the unemployment rates of both nations were equivalent. This decrease in the existing gap shows that Canada's unemployment rate is trending toward the unemployment rate of the United States. Furthermore, since the 1980s, Canada's unemployment rate has risen and fallen with the unemployment rate of the USA. The economic performance and levels of employment of our neighbors is becoming more and more pertinent to our levels of employment. Canada's biggest trading partner is the United States, with 75% of Canada's exports going to the United States in 2015, meaning Canada is very reliant on the economic success of their neighbors. As the USA prospers, Canada prospers. As the USA falters, Canada falters. Canada's trade with the U.S. will most likely continue to grow in the future, meaning this reliance with the USA will stay the same or even grow larger. All this points to the correlation between the nation's unemployment, and this correlation will likely stay for years to come.
In the long term, the Canadian unemployment rate is projected to trend around 6.7% in 2020.
Created using Powtoon.